Hi everybody, my name is Dante Barksdale, and I will be leading you through this lecture today on the Introduction to Ethnic Studies. All right, this will be the opening lecture to our class this term, and through it we'll just kind of understand and begin to look at the different reasons and people behind an organization leading the Call for Ethnic Studies, which was a development that was created around 50 years ago, mostly in the late 60s, as a reaction to the perpetual whitewashing of American history, mostly led by students and other people in college, such as yourselves, who wanted to understand America better and wanted to see themselves represented. All right, so that's what we will do today for this early part of the lecture, and we will get started right now. Okay? So this first slide here, and you can go ahead and pause the video if you want, just to kind of start thinking about some things. I'll read the couple questions, and then by all means, pause the video, take some time, think on this, because this will kind of come up throughout the lecture and the entire class on ethnic studies, okay? So first, what groups or demographics should be protected? And this could be any demographic, any population in the United States. The second one here is what groups fall under the ethnic studies umbrella or banner. You know, there are many of them. There's 4 main ones, but many others can also be included. So just jot down some notes, some ideas on who you think these people are, culturally, and how they fit into ethnic studies. All right, and I will be back. Begin the video again when you would like. Okay. So we will start now with the formation of ethnic studies. All right. This began, as I said, in the late 60s. There was a big push, kind of in the emerging civil rights movement as this reaches ahead in the mid 60s when some civil rights legislation was passed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. We're going to see that there's a big push by the 4 key demographics of ethnic studies to kind of have themselves represented in America and through the educational system. All right. This is not an exclusive list. This is just the 4 main demographics that advocated at San Francisco State, where the first ethnic studies department was created in the late 60s. All right. So we will begin here, and I will list the 4, and then we'll get into them specifically. So the big 4 who started ethnic studies at San Francisco State would be African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, who at the time called themselves Chicanos. There's a difference in those terms, but it was the Chicano rights movement who really got this part of education going for the department, and the Native American studies groups. All right. So San Francisco State University was the first of its kind to develop these things in general. All right. Of these 4 groups, many of them had been represented in very small numbers throughout the country, population-wise, but this was beginning to change. You know, World War II had many different people move around the country. They had different ideas. The children of these people in the civil rights movements were really wanting to understand their own histories and not be kind of swept up into the assimilationist policies that had happened. The late 1800s, early 1900s was rife with eugenics and America First policies that did not really help many people who weren't white. And this is an attempt to rectify them. All right. So with this, we can see the College of Ethnic Studies developed. It's created in 1968 at San Francisco State, as I've said, but it does come out of the civil rights movements. All right. Mostly led by the African American civil rights movements, but the other ones will branch off and develop their own policies, their own ideas, and their own goals after this in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, as these programs are being developed and spread across the country. All right. So if we look at it here, this quote says, "Ethnic studies is the interdisciplinary study of race and ethnicity as understood through the perspectives of major underrepresented racial groups in the U.S. It analyzes the sociocultural, intellectual, and historical experiences that inform the construction of racial, gender, and cultural identities." So ethnic studies is more than just a literature class or a history class or an anthropology class. It combines all of these different academic disciplines into one department to look at the different ways that race and ethnicity are understood and how they impact people and societies. All right, so this is kind of revolutionary for the time, because at this time it was said to Arthur Schomburg, who was a African American scholar of the Harlem Renaissance era, when he was a young man in the school, young child in Puerto Rico, his teacher told him, Black people have no history. There is nothing to study for them. There is nothing here. All right. He decided to change that, and his personal collection of ephemera, memorabilia, books, and everything became the centerpiece of the New York Public Library's Black Studies Library in Harlem. All right. So just because people at this time did not think there was history, the people who were part of these demographics, of these races and ethnicities, knew there was stuff to be had. And that's what they're going to start fighting for. All right. So we'll move on to the next slide here. All right. As I've said, ethnic studies comprises of 4 key demographics based on the charters in the late 1960s. However, many other demographics have been able to enter this field. It's not exclusionary. So we have African American studies, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, which was at the time called Chicano studies, and Native American studies. All right. These are the 4 key ones, but in these, there's also Middle Eastern American studies. Sometimes it comes into religion, so Islamic American studies. All these different people who need to be represented can fit in this ethnic studies banner. All right. So if you're thinking about who could be included, who is included when you were doing a quick write, the answer is a lot of different people. All right. Just because the scholastic part of it focuses on 4 key demographics does not mean that is the only 4 there. All right. In the greater part of this class, we will look at the intersections of these, because these also do not exist in a bubble. All right. The way African Americans interact with Native Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, and the way they all interact with each other is also a key part of this nation's history and the relationship these different cultures and groups have to each other. All right, so it's all intertwined here, as you can see in this image with the hands holding each other. All right, they're all connected. So the next thing we're going to do is just look at a few key moments throughout the history of these groups, all right, and how they impacted different things. So this first one here, Miseducation of the Negro. All right. This was a book written by Carter G. Woodson, who was an early 20th century African American scholar, educator, and he wrote this book to counteract the prevailing notions of what Negro history was at the time. This would be the antiquated term for Black people or African Americans. At the time, it was not considered offensive. This was the preferred term. But in the 1960s, it changes to Black or African American. So do know that this title is nothing offensive. All right. He did encourage African American history and properly educating people of the American past. Similar to Arthur Schomburg, he knew there was history of African American people here. He knew that they were much more than just slaves who had been transported from uncivilized, godless Africa, and there was a history going back thousands of years to the ancient kingdoms of Africa, Ghana, Great Zimbabwe, Egypt. These other cultures have history there. So why does it end when it crosses the Atlantic? All right. He was a really big proponent of Negro History Week. He proposed this to happen in mid-February to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln, the man who started the Emancipation Proclamation and started the ending of slavery in this country during the Civil War. And as well, he was going to honor a very famous African American whose birthday is also in mid-February. All right, that's why these 2 dates here coincide with this. With this going on, he chose that week. This week will become really important to African Americans, but on a very small level. It's not a nationally known policy, but it does become one. All right, this evolves into Black History Month. All right, at Kent State in 1970s, the first school to honor Black History Month. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Frederick Douglass was the African American slave. I'm not sure if I said that. Whose birthday was near Lincoln's, and why Black History Month is now celebrated in February. All right. Moving forward, we have the Delano Grape Strike. This was led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who were the kind of leaders of the UFW, the United Farm Workers, along with their Filipino and Filipino American allies, who protested the poor working conditions of farm workers, primarily in the Central Valley. All right. However, this becomes much bigger. All right. The children of braceros who were here from World War II, who had known their family had crossed the border back and forth, those who had known that their family members or friends had been deported during the 1930s, during the Repatriation Acts, during the Great Depression, and those who had known that their maybe grandparents had come to the United States in World War I to work in the agricultural fields or the industries, or those who had been here since before the U.S. annexed the northern third of Mexico in the 1850s, all had a place here. But that was not being told in the U.S. history overall. So this is what they're fighting for here. The Delano Grape Strike brings a lot of attention and information about these people to the kind of larger American country. At this time, Mexican Americans and Chicanos were more or less relegated to the American Southwest. All right, so they had not, in large numbers, moved to other parts of the country, but this put it on a national scale. We'll have artists such as Jorge Gonzalez and Luis Valdez who write and produce art about these issues, about these problems that they want to address in American culture. And these kind of all culminate here in the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts, where tens of thousands of primarily Mexican American, but also other students from East Los Angeles walked out in protest of their schools because they were opposing and protesting the lack of information about their heritage, about their education, and about their people's role in the United States. Next, we have the first Convocation of American Scholars in 1970. This will be the group that kind of solidifies Native American studies in 1970. All right, this had been emerging out of different Native American movements such as AIM and others, but this was when it was solidified into creating Native American studies. This was pushing back against U.S. cultural anthropologists in the early 1900s, such as Alfred Kroeber, who had some interesting and at times problematic views on Native Americans, but his voice had been the supreme one describing Native Americans for decades. So part of this is pushing back against this. The 1960s and 1970s was a tumultuous time in the United States, but also in Native Americans, as we have different Native American tribes being unrecognized. A lot of them were in California, and other issues here. Boarding schools had, for the most part, ended, but that did not mean the assimilation tactics of the kind of overarching U.S. state had ended. All right. So this is the book you can see that was published out of this convocation that happened at Princeton as the edited volume there. This last one we'll look at here is Yuji Ichioka and Emma Gee. These were two Asian Americans. Yuji was Japanese American, Emma was Chinese American, who were at UC Berkeley. All right. And at this time of tumult and civil rights movement, they create the Asian American Political Alliance in 1968. And this was done to bring in all Americans of Asian descent into one group. Prior to that, similar to the way that Latinos had been mostly Puerto Ricans in New York, Cubans in Florida, and Mexican Americans in the Southwest, many Asian Americans identified with their ethnicity. So Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American. These were done to kind of bring everyone in together. All right, that was the goal of these two individuals who helped craft the term Asian American. All right, but why is it important? That's the question. Ethnic studies is important. It combines many other departments into thinking different ways about the roles of people in this country. All right, there are current issues here. Many parts of the country are trying to defund the education of different groups to kind of promote a certain American idea of history, but that is a false one. Everyone has been here for as long as everyone else has. Native Americans predeceased any colonizers. African Americans were brought in large numbers beginning in the 1600s. Latino Americans had been here when it was part of Spain and Mexico, and Asian Americans started coming in the 1800s in large numbers to the West Coast. So the story of America is a story of everyone here combined. All right, it's not just one or the other, and that is why ethnic studies is important. It brings all of these different voices to the front so everyone can see themselves as a piece of the country. All right, thank you.